She was 19 years old, standing at the edge of a dirt road with a canvas grip in one hand and the whole of her life folded inside it, when the only man left who called himself her family told her that the house she had been born in was no longer hers to sleep in. That man was her uncle, Josiah Pruitt, and the reason he gave was money. The mortgage her late father had taken to survive one hard winter, a debt Josiah claimed as his to collect the moment her father's heart gave out in the smithy. What Adeline Voss had, after the wagon carrying the last of the furniture rattled off toward Cheyenne, was $11.40 sewn into the hem of her second petticoat, a mother's silver thimble, and a stubbornness that no one in Amity Ridge, Wyoming territory, had ever managed to break. It was with 10 of those dollars, every cent she dared to spend, that she bought, at a dust-choked courthouse auction nobody else wanted to attend, the crumbling, bird-nested ruin of old Fort Vesper, abandoned since the Army marched its garrison east 11 years before. The auctioneer laughed when he took her money. The clerk laughed harder when he wrote the deed. Everyone in that room agreed it was the purchase of a desperate, foolish girl who did not know a ruin from an opportunity. But sealed behind a false wall in the fort's silent old armory was a secret that had waited 17 years to be found, one that would not only change the whole shape of Adeline's life, but would give an entire forgotten town back its honor. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Voss. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, tell us where you're from in the comments. We'd love to know we're not so far apart after all. Adeline had been raised, for most of her short life, in the warm, iron-scented world of her father's smithy, and it was there, more than in any schoolhouse, that she had learned who she was. Elijah Voss had come to the Wyoming Territory in the year 1869, a widower with a small daughter and a set of blacksmith's tools that had belonged to his own father, and he had built, plank by plank and coal by coal, a modest forge at the edge of Amity Ridge that served every rancher, farmer, and freighter for 30 miles in any direction. He was not a wealthy man, but he was known, and in a country still stitching itself together out of open plains and hard winters, to be known and trusted was its own kind of fortune. Adeline grew up with the ring of the hammer as her lullaby and the patient, careful hands of her father as her first and finest teacher. By the time she was 12, she could shape a horseshoe that fit true on the first try. By 15, she understood the temper of iron better than most grown men who called themselves smiths. And she had learned, too, the deeper lesson her father wove into every lesson at the anvil, that nothing in this world was worthless simply because it looked spent. A bent nail could be straightened. A cracked wheel rim could be reforged. A thing thrown away by one man's carelessness might still hold, inside it, everything another man needed. Look twice before you judge a thing done for, her father used to tell her, tapping a rusted scrap of iron before it went into the fire, because the fire doesn't care what a thing used to be. It only cares what it can become. Her mother, Ruth, had died of a fever when Adeline was only 6, but the small silver thimble she left behind had traveled with Adeline every day since, tucked into a pocket sewn close to her heart, a quiet reminder that her mother had once sat at that same hearth and mended what others considered beyond repair. It was Ruth's sister, married to Josiah Pruitt, who had come to help raise Adeline after her mother's passing, and for a few years the arrangement held some shape of family, though Josiah himself had never warmed to the girl, seeing in her, perhaps, all the reasons his own ambitions in Amity Ridge had never quite taken flight. He ran a modest dry goods counter that never seemed to prosper the way the bank across the street did, and he watched Elijah Voss's honest, unhurried success at the forge with an envy he never spoke aloud, but which colored every word he ever said to his niece. Still, Adeline did not dwell in his shadow. She spent her days at her father's side, learning the language of metal and fire, and her evenings reading whatever books the traveling peddler could spare her. And in this quiet, hard-working life she came to hold two convictions that would carry her through everything that followed. That skill honestly earned could never truly be taken from a person. And that patience, properly used, was not weakness, but a kind of strength too slow for cowards to practice. She did not know, in those unhurried years of girlhood, how soon she would need both of those convictions with her whole heart, nor how far from the smithy's warm light her road was about to lead her. The fall came the way falls often do in a hard country, not all at once, but in a slow unraveling that gathered speed until there was nothing left to hold on to. In the winter of Adeline's 17th year, her father took a chill helping a stranded freight crew dig their wagon from a drift outside of town. And though he seemed at first only weary, the chill settled deep in his chest, and by the time the doctor from Laramie could be summoned, it had become the same fever that had claimed her mother a decade before. Elijah Voss died on a gray February morning with his daughter's hand in his, and his last words to her, spoken so quietly she had to lean close to catch them, were that she must never let anyone convince her that what she carried inside her, her skill, her patience, her name, could be sold or stolen, no matter what happened to the forge or the house. She would come to understand, in the months that followed, exactly why he had said it. Josiah Pruitt, as it turned out, held the note on the small mortgage her father had taken during the drought years, a debt Elijah had always intended to pay down slowly and honestly, and which Josiah had quietly purchased from the bank without ever telling his brother-in-law, waiting, some said later, for exactly this moment. Within a month of the funeral, Josiah declared the debt due in full, and when Adeline, barely 18, grieving and utterly unprepared for the cold arithmetic of frontier law, could not produce the sum, he took the smithy, the tools, the small house behind it, and sold every piece at auction to settle accounts that the townsfolk quietly suspected he had inflated in his own favor. He kept for himself the finest of her father's tools, claiming they were owed to him as executor, and when Adeline dared to protest, he reminded her, in front of the very clerk drawing up the papers, that she was a young unmarried woman with no legal standing to argue matters of debt and inheritance, and that she ought to be grateful he had not simply put her out on the street the day her father died. He did put her out, in the end, only a season later, once the last of the estate's coin had passed through his hands, declaring the arrangement no longer sustainable for a man of his own modest means. Adeline left the only home she had ever known with a borrowed grip, a few changes of clothing, her mother's thimble, and $11.40 she had managed to hide from her uncle's ledgers by sewing them into her petticoat hem the very night her father died. Some quiet instinct in her insisting she would need a secret reserve before this was over. She spent 3 nights sleeping in the loft of a livery stable, whose owner, an old widower named Cornelius Hale, took pity on her without asking questions. And it was Cornelius, turning over a week-old newspaper one evening, who first mentioned that the county was auctioning off the old Army fort north of town for unpaid taxes, and that not a soul in Amity Ridge wanted the crumbling wreck of a place. Adeline, staring into the fire that night with nothing left to lose, and her father's words about the forge fire ringing in her memory, decided she would go and see it for herself. Fort Vesper sat some 4 miles north of Amity Ridge, on a low rise above a bend in Cottonwood Creek. And it had been, in its working years, a modest outpost garrisoned to protect freight routes and keep a wary peace with the bands who still moved through that country, before the Army closed it in the spring of 1878 and marched its last company east, leaving the buildings to the wind and the pack rats. By the time Adeline stood before it on the morning of the auction, its stockade fence had collapsed in 3 places, its barracks roof had caved under some forgotten winter's snow, and its parade ground had gone to sage and buffalo grass, so that the whole place looked less like a fort than like the bones of one, bleached and half buried in the prairie. The courthouse crowd that had gathered for the auction was thin and unserious, most of the men there for the more promising lots of grazing land being sold the same morning. And when the auctioneer finally called the fort itself, building, stockade, and the acre of ground it stood on, sold as a single unwanted lot, the room fell into the particular silence of an item no one intends to bid on. Adeline raised her hand before she had entirely decided to, and offered $10, and the auctioneer, after a pause in which he seemed to be deciding whether the offer was even worth acknowledging, brought his gavel down with a short, amused laugh, and just like that Fort Vesper belonged to a 19-year-old girl with nothing else in the world to her name. Josiah Pruitt, who happened to be standing near the back of the room settling some business of his own, turned to a companion and remarked, loud enough for half the courthouse to hear, that his niece had finally proven herself as foolish as her father had been sentimental, throwing away good money on a pile of rotten timber that even the pack rats were abandoning. Adeline said nothing. She had learned, in the hard months since her father's death, that dignity spoken aloud in a room that wished to shame you was often wasted breath, and that the truer answer to such mockery was simply to keep walking forward. She walked the 4 miles out to the fort that same afternoon with Cornelius Hale's borrowed mule and a lantern, and stood for a long while at the edge of the collapsed stockade, watching the low autumn sun paint the old log walls the color of a dying fire, and felt, for the first time since her father's death, something that was not quite hope, but was at least its distant cousin, a sense that she had been handed, however unlikely it seemed, a thing that was entirely and undeniably her own. She spent that first night in the old officers' quarters, the driest of the buildings, and it was the following morning, while clearing pack-rat nests and drifted leaves from what had once been the fort's armory, a low, thick-walled building of squared logs and iron-strapped doors, built stouter than any other structure on the grounds to keep its powder and arms secure, that she noticed something odd about the inner wall at the rear of the building. The logs there did not match the weathering of the rest of the room. They were set slightly proud of the surrounding timber, as though built up later, and behind a fallen shelf she found, half hidden by dust and cobweb, a narrow iron ring set flush into what she had taken for solid wall. It took Adeline the better part of 2 days to work that section of wall loose, using little more than a pry bar left behind in the fort's old blacksmith shed and the patient, careful hands her father had trained since childhood. And when at last a section of logging swung inward on a crude hinge of leather and iron, she found herself looking into a space no larger than a closet, dry and undisturbed, holding a single locked strongbox, a bundle of oilcloth-wrapped papers, and, propped against the strongbox, a soldier's forage cap gone soft with age. She sat for a long while simply looking at what she had found, her lantern throwing a small, warm circle of light into that hidden dark, before she gathered the courage to lift the oilcloth bundle free and untie its cording with fingers that trembled more from wonder than from cold. Inside were letters, a small leather-bound journal, and a set of ledger pages torn loose from some larger book. And as Adeline began, that same night, to read them by lantern light, the story that unfolded before her was one that Amity Ridge had never been told, and one that a great many people in that town, it would turn out, had very good reason not to want told. The journal belonged to a soldier named Sergeant Elias Foster, a free black cavalryman who had served at Fort Vesper as the post's quartermaster sergeant in its final years, responsible for the safekeeping of Army payroll and supply funds that moved through the outpost on their way to smaller garrisons further west. In careful, disciplined handwriting, Foster had recorded the ordinary business of a soldier's life: drills, weather, the small kindnesses and small cruelties of frontier duty. Until, in an entry dated the autumn of 1868, his account turned suddenly urgent and afraid. A payroll shipment of gold coin, some $6,000 intended for 3 smaller posts, had gone missing from the armory under his watch, and though Foster swore in his own hand that he had locked the strongbox himself and posted a guard through the night, the post's commanding quartermaster, a civilian contractor named Colonel Otis Bramwell, who oversaw Army supply contracts for the whole territory, declared the sergeant responsible and had him confined to await court-martial. The journal's final entries, written in a hand grown tighter and more desperate with each passing page, insisted that Foster had seen Bramwell himself near the armory that night, out of uniform and without cause to be there, and that he believed the colonel had taken the gold and meant to see an innocent black soldier hanged for it rather than risk his own name. The ledger pages, in a different hand entirely, appeared to be Bramwell's own private accounting. Records of land purchases made across the territory in the years immediately following. Land that Adeline recognized, with a slow chill spreading through her chest, as including much of what was now the town of Amity Ridge itself, the very ground beneath the bank, the courthouse, and half the main street, all of it acquired, according to these secret pages, with sums that matched almost exactly the value of the missing payroll gold. Sergeant Foster, the last letter in the bundle revealed, had died before any court-martial could be convened, of what the post surgeon recorded only as sudden illness while in confinement, and Colonel Bramwell had resigned his army contract within the year, settling instead as a leading citizen of the very town his stolen gold had helped to build. Adeline sat with the lantern guttering low and the papers spread across her knees, and understood, with a certainty that settled cold and clear in her chest, that she was holding in her hands the true hidden foundation of Amity Ridge, and that the strongbox beside her, when finally opened, would very likely hold what remained of gold that an innocent man had died protecting. Gold that a guilty man's descendants were, at that very moment, still living comfortably upon. News of Adeline's peculiar purchase had already begun to move through Amity Ridge, as such things always did in a small town, and when word further spread, carried, some said, by Cornelius Hale's well-meaning mention of lantern lights seen at the old fort past midnight, that the Voss girl was digging around in the ruins and had found something, the town's curiosity sharpened into something less friendly. Adeline had intended, at first, only to confirm what the papers suggested before she spoke a word to anyone, and so she rode into town to consult the county recorder's office, asking with careful casualness to see the original land grant records for the parcels now occupied by the bank and the courthouse square. It did not take long for that quiet inquiry to reach the ears of Thaddeus Bramwell, grandson of Colonel Otis Bramwell, and now the president of the very bank that stood. According to those secret ledger pages, on ground his grandfather had purchased with stolen army gold. Thaddeus was a smooth, careful man, well regarded in Amity Ridge for his contributions to the church roof fund and his seat on the school board, and it was precisely that respectability he moved swiftly to protect. He called on Adeline himself at the fort within the week, arriving in a fine buggy with an offer that he framed as generosity, $300, a fortune to a homeless girl of 19, for the deed to Fort Vesper exactly as it stood, no questions asked about anything she might or might not have found there. Adeline, who had spent 2 sleepless nights weighing exactly what she owed to a dead soldier's memory against what $300 could mean for a girl with nothing, told him she would consider the offer, and watched something flicker behind his composed features that told her, more than any words could, precisely how much he already knew, and precisely how much he had to lose. When she did not sell within the week, the pressure shifted from generosity to something harder. Rumors began moving through town that the fort's original sale had been improper, that a girl so young and so recently orphaned had no legal capacity to hold a deed at all. And Josiah Pruitt, whether out of his own old bitterness or some quiet arrangement with Thaddeus Bramwell, Adeline never learned for certain, filed a formal challenge to the auction itself, claiming as her nearest kin that any property acquired by his ward ought rightfully to pass through his guardianship. It was Cornelius Hale and a handful of others who had quietly begun to believe in the strange, stubborn girl living out at the old fort, who first stood beside her when the challenge came to a hearing before the county judge, testifying to her age of majority under territorial law and to the plain fact that the auction had been open, public, and fairly won. Adeline herself, called finally to speak, did something no one in that courtroom expected. Rather than defend her purchase in vague terms, she laid Sergeant Elias Foster's journal, the torn ledger pages, and Colonel Bramwell's old land purchase records directly before the judge, and asked, in a voice that trembled only slightly, that the court examine whether the town's very foundation had been built upon a theft and a dead man's ruined name. The room that had gathered to see a homeless girl put back in her place fell instead into a silence far heavier than the one that had greeted her $10 bid months before. And Thaddeus Bramwell, watching his family's careful respectability begin to crack open in front of the entire town, understood that no offer of money was going to close this back up again. The county judge, a deliberate and unhurried man named Josiah Reeves, no relation, Adeline was quick to note, to her uncle, ordered a formal review of both the fort's sale and the land records Adeline had presented. And in the weeks that followed, as surveyors and Army pension officials were written to, and old post records were requested from Washington, the whole of Amity Ridge found itself waiting on the answer to a question it had never thought to ask about its own ground. Adeline, meanwhile, finally worked the strongbox open with a set of tools borrowed once more from Cornelius Hale's shed, and found inside, wrapped in decayed canvas, $4,100 in gold coin, not the full sum Foster's journal had recorded as missing, suggesting Bramwell had already spent a portion before hiding the rest, perhaps intending to retrieve it later and never quite daring to return. Adeline did not spend a cent of it on herself, not even to secure a proper roof over her own head. And when this fact became known through the town, through Cornelius, who could not help but speak proudly of the girl he had come to think of almost as his own, it did more to turn public sentiment in her favor than any argument a lawyer could have made. When the Army's own pension office confirmed at last, based on the journal and post records matched against surviving muster rolls, that Sergeant Elias Foster had indeed died in confinement under suspicious circumstances, and had left behind, back east, a widow and a daughter who had never received so much as a formal explanation of his death, Judge Reeves ruled not only that Adeline's ownership of Fort Vesper stood unchallenged, but that the land beneath the bank and courthouse, having been demonstrably purchased with funds traceable to the stolen payroll, carried a moral and likely legal debt back to Sergeant Foster's surviving family and to the community itself. Thaddeus Bramwell did not go to prison. The law of that place and time was not built to reach so far back for a dead man's crime. But he watched, in the months that followed, as depositors quietly moved their savings from his bank to the new one that opened in Cheyenne, as his seat on the school board was not renewed, and as the respectable name his family had worn like a fine coat for two. Generations came apart, thread by thread, in the same public gaze he had always relied upon to protect him. It was, in its way, exactly the kind of quiet justice her father had once tried to teach her about at the forge. Not punishment delivered by another's hand, but the plain truth finally allowed to do its own slow, patient work. Adeline, once the gold and the land questions had been settled by the court, might easily have kept the fortune for herself and lived comfortably for the rest of her days, and not a soul in Amity Ridge, watching all she had endured, would have begrudged her that choice. Instead, she called a town meeting in the very courthouse that had once mocked her purchase, and stood before her neighbors, Josiah Pruitt seated stiffly among them, having quietly withdrawn his guardianship claim once the judge's ruling made it plain how little sympathy remained for him, and proposed that the gold be used to build two things the town had long needed and never had the means to provide: a proper schoolhouse, larger and sturdier than the one-room shack the children had outgrown years before, and a small infirmary to serve the outlying ranches, where more than one family had lost someone to a fever or an accident for want of care, closer than the long ride to Laramie. She asked, too, that a portion be set aside and sent east to Sergeant Foster's widow and daughter, not as charity but as a debt long overdue, and that a marker be placed at Fort Vesper itself, plain and honest, naming Elias Foster as the soldier who had died protecting what was never his to lose. The town, moved by all it had witnessed, and perhaps a little ashamed of how quickly it had once laughed her out of its courthouse, agreed without a single dissenting voice. Fort Vesper itself Adeline kept, restoring the armory with her own hands and her father's old craft, and though she never again lacked for a roof or a meal, what she prized most in the years that followed was not the gold at all, but the forge she built beside the fort's rebuilt gate, where she took up her father's trade once more and became, in time, the finest and most trusted smith for 30 miles in any direction, exactly as he had once been. It is worth remembering, now, how this story began. A 19-year-old girl standing at the edge of a dirt road with nothing but a borrowed grip and $11 sewn into her hem, cast out by the one relation who should have protected her, laughed at for spending her last $10 on a ruin no one else would touch. What Adeline Voss found sealed inside that abandoned armory was never simply gold, though the gold mattered, and it was never simply proof of an old crime, though the proof mattered too. What she found, and what she gave back tenfold to the town that had dismissed her, was the truth of something her father had told her at his forge years before, that nothing is worthless simply because someone else has decided to throw it away, and that patience, applied honestly and without bitterness, can eventually set right what haste and cruelty once broke. Sergeant Elias Foster waited 17 years in that hidden wall for someone willing to look twice at a ruin others had abandoned, and it was fitting, in the end, that the one who found him was a young woman who understood, in her own bones, exactly what it meant to be written off before anyone had bothered to look closely at her worth. Amity Ridge remembers her still, not as the foolish girl who wasted her last $10, but as the woman who bought an abandoned fort and found, inside it, enough truth and enough grace to rebuild an entire town's honor along with her own. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Adeline Voss. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that value is often hiding in the places we've stopped looking. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real worth in something or someone that others had already written off? Until next time, stay close.